We're back in the commentary room now. Both my microphone and your microphone are on. Phil, welcome back for round two.
Yeah, looks to be a pretty interesting pairing up of decks. Definitely excited to see what exactly Dylan has got cooking in this four-color Omnath pile. Especially with this Underground Sea, it looks like it might be maybe just splashing black for things like Deathrite Shaman activations.
Yeah, likely.
But yeah, it's definitely a pretty interesting kind of construction. Probably looking to play a fairly mid-range game with the Titular Omnath being a card with a lot of text on it. It does a lot of things and it interacts really favorably with fetch lands.
Big time. So yeah, we do see that odd Underground Sea, and I did ask Dylan what he was playing, and he said some Omnath pile. So we might even see the whole 5-color being played here. But yeah, Omnath, the titular card of this deck, perfectly represents what the deck is trying to do, which is ETB draws a card, 4-mana, 4/4. You have landfall. On the first one, you get life. On the second one, you get 4 colors of mana back. And on the third landfall trigger for the turn, you deal 4 damage to all creatures and all planeswalkers. No, all players and all planeswalkers. And so you're very unlikely to get to the, not completely unlikely, but kind of unlikely to get to the third landfall trigger unless you're a dedicated lands package. But yeah, as you said, fetch lands really powering out that process.
I mean, you can always hold a fetch land if you know you are playing around with cards like Omnath. And I mean, with being in blue, Dylan also has access to your brainstorms and other effects like that, where you don't necessarily want to throw off every fetch land you see just for the sake of it. There's often a lot of value in holding them rather than the minuscule thought process of thinning the lands and the dead draws out of your deck. I mean, there are some decks where that might be the right play, but when you have access to cards like Omnath and Brainstorm, often having that additional land play or that shuffle effect ready and available is quite powerful.
Yeah, huge.
I don't know exactly the list that Dylan is running, but when Omnath was first printed and I came up with a list, it was actually white that was the lightest color.
Okay.
And it was really only just splashing for Omnath and the Teferi at the time.
Okay.
Because black just has so many powerful mid-range effects.
Yeah.
So it is possible that Dylan is only looking at it for cards like Deathrite Shaman, but it is also possible that he is pretty heavily indexed into it. You get your Abrupt Decays and cards like that are just really, really strong in Highlander and in these sort of mid-range decks.
Yeah, big time. So we'll see the exact contents of his deck, but I saw in his opening hand climb the beanstalk, up the beanstalk, a 2-mana enchantment that ETBs on, draws a card on ETBs, and also whenever you cast a 5 CMC spell or higher. So all of the evoke elementals, leyline binding, these sorts of things can sort of get you card advantage back, but it kind of leans you also into playing sort of a control package, like maybe even playing Miracles or Delve or something like that. Like you're trying to find a way to also make those 5 CMC spells or higher easier to cast.
I mean, even just the cantrips that we saw early on, and the fetch lands that you are so heavily indexed into in a 4 or 5 color deck like this, make it really easy to fuel delve for cards like Tasiga, which is a pretty powerful card in this kind of deck.
Yeah.
So you have that, and you have your elementals, and I mean even the floor for Up the Beanstalk is that it's a 2-mana cantrip, which is it's playable.
Fine anyway, yeah.
You're probably not happy about it, but I guess against a deck like Grixis Control, I mean, at the moment, Jeff is putting no pressure on Dylan really at all.
Yeah.
So just, a 2-mana cantrip that maybe represents more card value down the line isn't really that bad.
And we're going to see an interesting one here. Unfortunately, it's going to get countered, or I think we're just brainstorming actually. But this is Aragorn, King of Gondor, a Jeskai and 1 creature. So another 4 mana sort of. This is like we were talking about titular cards, and Omnath was one of them. Aragorn and other Aragorn are 2 4 mana cards that are huge and powerful. And this is going to be really big for Dylan. On you get the Monarch, and I think your creatures gain indestructible when it attacks. There's another line of text as well, but there's a lot happening with the Jeskai Aragorn, and it's definitely seen some play as well. And it is going to stick around here.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that with the sets like Lord of the Rings not being accessible to standard. A lot of the cards are really quite pushed. And yeah, Aragorn sitting there with, he's got Vigilance and Lifelink, he makes you the Monarch, and he prevents your opponent's creatures from blocking in a variety of ways with his last bit of text.
Yeah.
So I mean, becoming the Monarch is huge. That's obviously a huge amount of card advantage if Jeff can't find ways to take that back off of him. And then, I mean, it does depend exactly on what kind of possible creatures Jeff has, but I mean, removing the capacity for any kind of blocking is pretty strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of Lord of the Rings, what's next? They'll print a ring card. Yes, that's right. You've seen the first appearance of the One Ring, a 4 mana artifact that has swept the world. Taps to draw a card equal to the amount of, put a bird encounter on it, then draw cards equal to the amount of bird encounters on it. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you take damage equal to the amount of bird encounters you have. So it's been very interesting. It went to 1 point recently after seeing basically infinite play at 0. Just a 0 mana, colorless artifact can really do that for you. But we're going to see if it's pretty powerful here, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it also, I believe, gives you protection when the turn it comes in.
Not irrelevant at all.
No, so perhaps slightly egregiously, but I have heard it compared to sort of an ancestral recall for colorless.
Yeah.
Because you draw 1 card on the turn it comes in, you get protection, you draw 2 more.
I see that comparison.
Obviously, it does give your opponent a turn in between in which they can develop their board state, even if they can't necessarily threaten you.
Yeah.
But it is still really powerful, and there's a pretty small deck building cost to playing a 4 mana artifact. And I think we're seeing here an interaction where Jeff is able to untap it and activate it again, which is really strong.
Interesting. I think you're like Minamo there, the land that allows you to untap a legendary permanent. Yeah, and so it's untapping the ring from the hit TV show Lord of the Rings, and has allowed an extra 2 bird encounters, an extra bird encounter to go on there. Now we're talking about drawing 3 cards, so this is like pretty huge. You draw 2, you don't even get the dink from the upkeep from that 2 bird encounters, you go straight to 3, and suddenly you've just drawn, 6 cards in for only 4 mana.
Yeah, I mean, that's very, very strong, and in any sort of vaguely fair matchup where you're looking to kind of 1-for-1 with your opponent with your removal and your counter spells and other answers, being able to spend 1 card to draw 6 cards is obviously a huge swing in your favor. I mean, the damage isn't great for Jeff, but I mean, he has the capacity to stop whenever he sees fit, whether that's now or after 1 more activation.
Maybe 1, maybe 2, you know.
I mean, he's pulled so far ahead at this point that he probably doesn't need to activate it anymore. I mean, if he does hit a few dead draws, or Dylan throws something out that is uniquely difficult to deal with, and he needs a specific answer, he can activate the One Ring again then. But at the moment, he's sitting quite pretty.
Yeah, your hand's stacked. You've developed your board. We see the Murktide Regent there, another 1-pointed card, and with the maximum 5 +1/+1 counters on it, making it a 8/8 for 2 mana flying, which is nothing to sneeze at, not at all.
Yeah, I mean, it won't be able to block Aragorn, thanks to Aragorn making creatures unable to block, either 1 creature or all of them if he's the Monarch, but definitely represents the capacity to potentially race. We'll let Jeff take the Monarch back as well when it does attack, so it's not that Monarch doesn't represent as much of a card advantage engine as it otherwise might.
And unfortunately, I was about to say the tides may be turning for Dylan because here comes a Minskin Boo, but no, Jeff says, and Force of Negation exiling what I believe to be a daze to stop that from happening, and that's huge. I mean, Jeff, he has the blocker, he has the 8/8 to block the hamster, but there's nothing stopping us from just ticking up and passing the turn and then maybe flinging it or something like that, but Jeff didn't want to see any part of it at all.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff he's in a sort of interesting situation because he does have this massive creature, but it cannot block Aragorn, obviously, and Aragorn prevents a creature from blocking at all, not just blocking itself. So even with the Monarch kind of taken off, Jeff is in a position where his life total is sort of under a little bit of threat if he can't find an actual answer to Aragorn. Especially with the lifelink on Aragorn, it's making the race against this region a lot more winnable for Dylan than might be expected.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, we're seeing another cut here, and this is where things start getting really, really dirty. So we're going to untap, absolutely going to untap this ring, tap it again. Sheoldred's on the battlefield now, ladies and gentlemen. We saw what it did in match 1, where it won a game twice, or won 2 games, and now it's going to do it again because every time that Jeff taps the ring and draws cards, he's going to gain 2 life at a time, and that was enough for Dylan to scoop it up.
Yeah, it turns out that when every time you draw cards, you lose 1, but then you gain 2.
Yeah.
2 being bigger than 1 makes that pretty favorable.
Huge. One of my favorite interactions is in the maths world where 2 is bigger than 1. And so you can kind of go infinite, you know?
Yeah, I've heard that 2 is bigger than 1. Some people may try to claim otherwise, but I think they might have a hard time proving it.
Especially in this room.
Dylan has definitely just experienced that firsthand. Sheoldred really proving to be quite a menace in the format, despite not having the keyword.
Yeah, exactly. It's it does have death touch, no menace, but everything else about it does definitely make it very menacing. And perhaps we can begin the campaign today for Sheoldred to 1 point, but maybe not.
Probably not. I think that's a little bit much. It is. I mean, it is sort of the classic joke in Magic the Gathering of dies to removal.
Yeah.
But Sheoldred, while it does definitely take over a game if unanswered, it does get removed by something like a Terminate quite cleanly, which is a huge mana swing in that sort of situation. I think that as much as we attribute that game state to Sheoldred jokingly, it really was the One Ring that put
100%.
that put Jeff well and truly in the driver's seat, and Sheoldred kind of just cemented any chance that Dylan had of maybe winning with a cheeky couple of Aragorn attacks.
Yeah, exactly. Having unblockable good, but not perfect. From the chat, Dukes on Twitch, lovely to see you as well. Good to see CBR MTG live. And then we also have Red Mage saying, love the draw 5, get a Force of Will for the counter, and then gain 18 life. So there's a lot of powerful magic happening here as well, and Force of Negation being a pretty interesting part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, those sort of force cards usually represent card disadvantage, so you have to weigh up whether the freeness of the counterspell and the impactfulness of your opponent's card really warrants you playing it and using it. But obviously, when you have something like the One Ring to sort of just instantly refill your hand with as much juice as you could possibly want, that cost doesn't really exist anymore.
Yeah, 100%. Going into sideboards now, just getting a quick little peek about what we can see. I saw Jeff considering that Spell Snare, possibly taking it out, not seeing its value in that previous game. I like Spell Snare is actually kind of an interesting one because it really only fills one role, obviously, with its heavy restriction on only being able to get 2 CMC spells. But you do have to make that decision every time you're sideboarding, like, are the 2 CMC spells the ones that I care about? Or if in this case, perhaps it's the 4 CMC cards that I care about more, which is what Jeff was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of Spellsnaz's value comes from when you are in a sort of blue mirror, where its cheap cost and ability to hit a lot of very common cards like your Remand, Mana Leak, Counterspell, makes it very easy to win those sort of counter wars. And in a long extended game, you will eventually find a target for it.
Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting that Jeff is potentially operating off some fairly incomplete information. I mean, he saw a lot of colors of mana, and he saw an Aragorn, and I don't really know that Dylan got to deploy much else of his deck's game plan.
Yeah.
So he probably can deduce these against some kind of, creature-based mid-rangey deck, but and can make some somewhat informed sideboarding choices. But
It will be
perhaps might see some cards he didn't anticipate getting thrown at him game 2.
Yeah, and I think the Underground Sea in that early game possibly did throw a bit of a spanner in the works, because as we theorized before, the Underground Sea might just be a glorified island for Dylan in his 4-color no black deck. But I mean, if we see a Duress sideboard, if we see an Abrupt Decay, like Jeff's got to think about whether or not these are cards that he actually needs to consider, or if it's something that he can just forget about.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the possibility at some point in varying histories, Grixis Control has played a sufficiently sort of slow mana base with enough basics that they were able to pack a Blood Moon sideboard package of their own. And if Jeff is playing that and is able to land a Blood Moon, you sort of reach a point with decks like the one Dylan seems to be piloting, where you kind of just have to decide that Blood Moon games are lost games, and you kind of can only really play so many basics before you just cripple your ability to play your deck's game plan in games without Blood Moon.
Yeah. We'll see if Jeff is on the Blood Moon plan. Some Grixis Control decks opting for it. Honestly, at this point in Highlander, the reason to play Grixis is because you have access to that Blood Moon. Like, you can choose not to play it, and you can choose not to protect yourself from it, but it's just so easy to go into 4 colors or 5 colors these days, that being a 3-color deck is actually, you kind of got to be doing it for a reason, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there is always that. It's sort of an interesting card, Blood Moon, in that it does impact gameplay choices and deck building choices to a very large extent without necessarily ever hitting the game state. So I guess we'll see if it ends up being deployed here at all, but I imagine it's definitely a card that Dylan on this style of deck is pretty acutely aware of, and will be factoring into a lot of his lines today, even if he may never see it throughout the day.
Yeah, and that's kind of the power of Blood Moon as well, is that the threat of a Blood Moon is sometimes just as good. You know, you're playing around it, and maybe even I've been in a situation where I played around it and lost because I had mana troubles and there was no Blood Moon on the battlefield. You know, so
yeah, exactly.
Long after Blood Moon goes, it can still pack a punch for sure.
I think that certainly, if I'm in Dylan's position, a lot of the time I sort of just hope my opponent doesn't have it, because the deck is so sort of indexed into so many colors with so many different requirements on a lot of your spells that playing around Blood Moon hurts your mana base almost as much as your opponent actually casting it.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see. We have a little bit of protection here, or some exciting card is getting flashed into the battlefield. I'm not 100% sure what it is, but and Dylan agrees because we have a reader. So we'll see what happens. But it was in response to the. Thank you Dylan for pyroblasting this card that we didn't know what it was. But he did it in response to the Ren and 6 ticking down, targeting the Orcish Bowmasters. So wanted to quickly get something in there. Wasn't quite effective, but here we see the Tarmogoyf swinging in. Only a 2/3 at the moment, but good enough to go past this Orcish army, that's for sure.
I believe it should have 3 power with the Blast, the Bowmaster, and the Polluted Delta.
Oh, right, you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, thank you. And see that reflected in Jeff's life total as well. Thank you, Kate, in the chat. Tishana's Tidebinder stifles on ETBs, so trying to stifle that trigger. Kind of interesting. We saw, man, a long time ago, Armaket was Nimble Obstructionist, a 3/1 with flying that had cycling, and if you cycled it, you could stifle a activated ability or triggered ability. And it didn't see much play in Highlander, but maybe Jeff disagrees by wanting to play this Tasha's Tidebinder.
Yeah, there's always been sort of these stifles and stifle adjacent effects that have been kind of on the fringe of Highlander because their highs are really high.
Oh yeah.
I mean, sometimes you get game states where you get to stifle effect on activation and you just win the game.
Yep.
But they can also fairly easily get stranded in your hand without any text.
Yep.
So it's definitely something that you have to weigh up one way or the other, whether you want to, how deep you want to go into that kind of effect.
I enjoyed playing it a lot when I played it, particularly in Affinity, in Reanimator, because obviously everything post-board is all about getting rid of your graveyard with an activated ability, Tormod's Crypt, Unlicensed Hearse, and even Solitude and Fury in different cases. But there are a lot of targets for Stifle, at one point even stopping the initiative trigger. You know, there's so many ETBs now that I think there's a lot of value in it. We see even here, Spellseeker, famous 0-point card, using its ETB to get a 1 or 2 mana instant or sorcery from Dylan's deck and putting it into his hand. And it's going to be Ephemerate by the looks of it.
Yeah, I mean, Spellseeker, it obviously has the really impactful find in some lists of Ancestral Recall. It can also, in lists like this, potentially find Green Sun Zenith, which is itself a toolbox.
Yeah.
But I mean, Spellseeker itself is also a toolbox. You can pack your deck with a lot of 1 mana sort of bits and bobs, you know, your Lightning Bolts, your Swords to Plowshares, your Thought Seizers.
Yeah.
And it represents a lot of different things, which is really powerful.
Yeah, especially good in these types of decks that do want to get to 3 or 4 plus lands on the battlefield, because Spellseeker at 3 mana it can be a little bit awkward. We're going to see a nice one here where the Ephemerate, and you were talking about toolbox cards, I think this is sort of the generic choice for Spellseeker players. Ephemerate, a 1 mana instant that flickers a creature, but it also has rebound. So we're going to flicker it once, and then next turn we're going to flicker it again. So you do waste your first turn by getting Ephemerate, but then you get 2 extra activations from the Spellseeker over the next 2 turns, and one of them is going to get us a 4th Eralingus, which is going to be a really powerful card for Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, the ability to flicker, you can potentially get sort of blown out if your opponent has removal in response, but otherwise it's really, really good with a lot of cards that see play.
Oh yeah,
you
definitely.
know,
And it's a protection spell as well that we saw before. The Fatal Push was coming down from Jeff's side, targeting the Spellseeker, and then Dylan was like, I mean, obviously Jeff's just forcing the hand, but of course Dylan can in response just flicker it, and then the the Fatal Push is gone.
Yeah, I mean, it interacts really well with your Omnaths, with any creature with an ETB, as well as those new fancy evoke elementals, like your Furies and Solitudes, if you happen to be playing those.
Big time. Yeah, you're so right about that. Here comes a Tasiga, 4/5 from Days of Yore, 4 mana to activate it, and you can mill 2 cards and have your opponent choose whichever non-land card from there to put back into your hand. So a nice little bit of card advantage, especially when you delve it away. You can delve away all the cards that you don't want back in your hand if you have the option to. Of course, Jeff didn't have the option, he had to exile the whole thing, but it was enough to put Tasiga on the battlefield. Gain protection again this turn from the One Ring's second appearance this match, and a mental misstep on the Ephemerate's rebound.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like he's just opted to mental misstep that rebounded Ephemerate to prevent any kind of Fatal Push or similar. I guess Fatal Push doesn't actually work on Tasiga, despite his 1 mana cost, he secretly has a much higher CMC than that.
Yeah, another great reason to play Beans if you were playing Beans. Jeff has decided not to play Beans, but yeah, again, Delve sort of cheating that being a 6 mana card instead of a 1 mana card, which is how it's often cast as.
But I'm sure that somewhere in his list, Dylan definitely had spell-seekerable answers to the Tasiga or to the One Ring. Cards like Shattering Spree or a Braid, fairly easy to slot into this kind of deck.
Would you believe One Ring also has an extra line of text that says indestructible?
I would believe that.
Yeah, we're adding more to it. I think they decided that a 4 mana do nothing enchantment wasn't good enough, so they gave you protection for a whole turn, and they made it indestructible for some reason. So unfortunately, you can look at there's Cast into the Fire, which exiles an enchantment. So it's kind of funny. You can cast the ring into the fire as it's meant to be played, but otherwise you have to get pretty. You have to get pretty sneaky with what type of removal you want to play for this ring.
I believe there is also at least one edict where you can make your opponent sacrifice an artifact. But whether or not people choose to be on that, because I think it is a sorcery.
Yeah, so Angrath's Rampage, the only one that comes to mind now, perfectly utilizing that very slight black splash from Dylan, black and red sorcery, sacrifice a artifact, or you can make them sacrifice a creature, or you can make them sacrifice a planeswalker. So a lot of good modes. I think 2 mana sorceries is just a little bit harder these days.
Yeah, I think most people who want that kind of effect are opting into Sheoldred's Verdict instead, where you lose the text of artifacts, but it keeps planeswalkers. It's an instant, and it only costs black and then a generic mana.
Yeah, also sneaks tokens as well. Actually really relevant text for if you have a token and a non-token creature, because Sheoldred's Edict lets you choose non-token creature or token. And so they can't choose to sacrifice their 1 mana, their 0 mana 1/1 token. They have to sacrifice their card that they like.
Yeah, it's definitely quite powerful. And I guess with Angrath's Rampage only proving superior in sort of exactly this scenario where you're looking down at the One Ring.
Yeah, we'll see what Dylan has. We saw the new Reckless Impulse adventure card getting that Spell Snare. Kind of a funny, I think you play this card anyway because it's pretty good from memory. Quirion Druid Dryad. It has if you cast a non-green spell, you get a +1/+1 counter. And then it also has Reckless Impulse as the adventure. But Reckless Impulse, when you're getting a Spell Snare, less good. Maybe we can bait Jeff into playing a 2 mana spell so we can get that Spell Snare.
Yeah, depending on what sort of hand Jeff is sitting on, you can potentially, with that Spell Snare, feel a little bit safer deploying some threats because you do have that Spell Snare, for the very least at this turn, to protect it against some counterspells. And Jeff is sitting on 2 mana, representing a lot of those counterspells. So while Spell Snare isn't the greatest hit in the world, it's potentially got at least a little bit of value in this game state.
Yeah, absolutely. Checking out Tarmogoyf levels at the moment. There's definitely a land, there's definitely a sorcery. I haven't seen any creatures die yet, and then there's a couple of instances on Jeff's side. So perhaps Tarmogoyf is a 3/4.
Yeah, I believe there was a creature previously, but it was delved away with Tasiga.
I see.
But it is still fairly large, and here Dylan's opting to crack in, sort of representing that lightning bolt from his exile. So he can trade that Goyf with the Tasiga, or he's just hoping that the Goyf gets allowed through and the Spellseeker gets eaten, which I'm sure he's perfectly happy with that outcome as well.
Yeah, I wonder what the thought process is. Maybe Dylan has his own Fatal Push, but yeah, we are going to see what blocks are happening here and going down to 7. So only 3 power, but now it will be 4 power, but only after combat damage is dealt.
Yeah, so I guess the line here is that the Spellseeker does 1, Lightning Bolt does 3, and I imagine the last point is coming from Ren and 6. which we see
There
here.
you go. Okay.
So yeah, he's managed to crack in quite a bit of damage
impressive.
with the Tarmogoyf. He's gotten rid of his opponent's Tasigur, and he has managed to utilize all of the cards that he put into exile there, including the Spell Snare, which
Incredible.
ate a counterspell and protected that Lightning Bolt. So he's gotten a huge amount of value that turn.
Yeah.
And he's even against the One Ring, he's sitting in a pretty good board state because that life that the One Ring is taking away from Jeff is actually quite meaningful with these current life totals.
Yeah.
Jeff only sitting at 5, Tarmogoyf and Ren and 6 both representing very real threats to that unless Jeff is able to find something like Sheoldred again in game 2.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see what Jeff can find, but yeah, as you said, it's the burden of the ring is becoming a little bit of a burden. I mean, we have, I believe, only 3 counters on the ring, and he's at 5 life, so you know it's only a couple of turns before this ring something needs to happen to it. Either it can be bounced or sometimes I've just seen it stay on the battlefield and you just hope for the best. But if that's Jeff's plan, then he might be in a bit of trouble here.
Yeah, I mean, he is quite far behind on the board state. I'm not exactly sure what he does have in his hand, but if he can't sort of find something soon to both deal with Dylan's board as well as prevent that from sort of chipping away his own life total, he's going to find himself facing down in game 3.
Yeah, it could be good for Dylan. It does look like he's a bit ahead. Although Jeff's got more things to play. He's tapping that beautifully altered Underground Sea. They fetched out, getting this preordained just to have another little look. It's not what we want, so we're going to try again. The ring's already tapped. Miyamo wouldn't go astray, but it'll only serve to delay the inevitable, which is Jeff's the importance of Jeff finding an answer to his own ring.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he really needs to have the answer sort of now because he is facing down a lethal Tarmogoyf. I'm not quite sure how large the other creature Dylan has is, but I mean, the One Ring would deal 3 to him, which means Ren and 6 is also lethal all by itself if Jeff doesn't have an answer. And I mean, there are definitely answers available, but if Jeff doesn't have those, he could very well just be dead here.
Yeah, this is the draw that Jeff was looking for. It has to come at the cost of evoking, but here we see Fury, new card. Well, newish, I guess, part of the evoke elemental cycle, and it is going to exile a red card from Dylan's hand and deal 4 damage as Dylan chooses amongst planeswalkers and creatures he controls. We definitely got rid of the Ren and 6. Whether or not we can get rid of these other 2 drops that are both individually lethal now, thanks to the new type in the graveyard. Tarmogoyf is now a 4/4. 4/5.
I think there's both Planeswalker and creature now in the graveyard.
Oh, absolutely.
So Goyf is well and truly a big lad and seems to have pushed us to a game 3.
It's truly interesting as well. We forgot about the 4th Aerolingus, but that was a very early grab from the Spellseeker. A 2 and X sorcery that says make X 2/2s with trample and haste. If your creatures dealt combat damage this turn, you get the Monarchy. So you can actually just cast it X as 0 if you have creatures on the battlefield already, just to get the Monarchy. But otherwise, just a huge token producer, and something that was recently sort of pegged for pointing and did not receive it. And now Dylan's reaping the rewards.
Yeah, it's definitely a hugely powerful card. If you are ahead in state, as you say, you can play it X is 0, gain the Monarch as early as turn 2. You know, if it's turn 1 drop, turn 2 become the Monarch. That's going to really cement your position in the driver's seat for the game.
Yeah.
Even X is 1 potentially on an empty board. The token itself can make you the Monarch, and then as a sort of late game blowout like it was here, you know, making 4 or 5 tokens, going wide around your control opponent. If they don't have a counterspell for your card, I mean, board wipes are pretty awkward because the tokens have haste, so you're
Yeah.
taking at least one crack first.
Yeah, yeah.
And 1-for-1 removal against a board of 2/2 tokens is just not really where you want to be either.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we just don't see that many board wipes in the format anymore. I mean, there might be some more out of Jeff's sideboard, but it's also just really tempting to also be the deck that plays to the board because there's so many good creatures that come out. So I think only the really dedicated control decks would be considering the board wipes at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is that a lot of the creatures printed, like there are creatures sort of printed now that are worth playing in your control deck, whether it's your Tassigas or your Snapcasters, cards like that. The idea of playing a board wipe isn't necessarily as free as it once was in your control deck.
Yeah.
But it's also just the fact that 4 mana is a lot.
Totally.
You can't sort of just let your opponent deploy whatever they want until you assemble 4 mana and then wipe the board. Because if you do that against aggro decks, a lot of the time you are just going to die.
Yeah, we got a brief look at the hand from the hand cams before the game started, but Dylan also wants a look, and we're seeing a great hand from Jeff's side. I see Reanimate, I see Fatal Push, Expressive Iteration, Mental Misstep, and a couple of lands. And goddamn, that's a good hand. It's could be everything that Jeff needs to have that really early start and protect himself from Dylan's onslaught as well.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that Jeff opted not to Mental Misstep that Gitaxian Probe. Whether he potentially values another 1-drop a little bit down the line, but having that information against your control opponent of exactly which answers they have is really, really strong.
Huge.
And I mean, sort of the cheeky Reanimate jig is now up.
Yeah.
It's obviously still a fairly powerful card in the matchup, but at least Dylan now knows that it's there, can potentially play around it with delve effects or other cards that might interact with the graveyard.
Yeah.
Or just deploy his threats in an order where Jeff is inclined to reanimate something that might not be as potent as what Dylan can then follow it up with.
Yeah, it's and we've seen this in games in the past as well, where the information gained from Gitaxian Probe is huge. I mean, as you said before, like Dylan now knows how he's going to play around those spells because he's seen them all. So maybe he was going to deploy his favorite 1-drop, but now maybe he'll wait and do a second favorite 1-drop so that the other one can get fatal pushed. And the same for the graveyard. As you mentioned before, he has a little bit more control over his graveyard now than he did before because he has this information from the Gitaxian Probe. So we have all the information, of course, through our hand cams, but to give a player that kind of power, incredible.
Yeah, I mean, especially in this sort of matchup against where you are sort of playing this very mid-rangey deck against a control deck, deploying your threats in the right order to beat the answers that your opponent has is usually how you win in these games. Sometimes you just get an unfair start, or they just brick one too many draws. But in most games, it's really about deploying your threats in the correct order to get the most out of them based on your opponent's answers.
Yeah.
Which sometimes is a bit of a guessing game, particularly in a singleton format like Highlander, where all of the threats and all of the answers pair up so weirdly and differently. But having the perfect information on exactly what your opponent is working with lets you make so much more informed decisions about what you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was going to say maybe this is our fatal push target, but in this instance, I don't even think the value of Dylan's cards in a vacuum means that Dylan can just play a 2-drop, and it's already huge. This creature that we saw before, it has domain and it's equal to its power, and so we're right up there, and that was like a lethal threat if it stayed around the battlefield for long enough. And so Jeff had to fatal push it. But if Dylan's planning on something bigger, then I'd be wanting to watch out. That's for sure. Ooh.
Yeah, it looks like the mental misstep is now coming out to eat a pyroblast that was trying to protect another of Dylan's threats.
Yeah. So the Drown in the Lock was the card to take out our 2-drop that we saw before, our domain 2-drop. Banger of a card. Whew. But yeah, the Adrenaline Lock is gone, the Mental Misstep is gone, and the Pyroblast is gone. So it's nice to have those kind of big counter wars where you can, especially if you're up. I mean, it didn't work out in this instance because Jeff was the winner of that counter war, and now the board is clear, and Jeff is possibly in a pretty good place if he can answer whatever Dylan's got coming up right now.
Dylan has managed to work through a lot of the cards in Jeff's hand. I think he's only got the Reanimate and then 2 more cards at this point. He's probably pretty happy to see that counterspell against the Big Daddy Omnath himself.
Yeah, it's really tough playing those big cards into 4 open mana from your Grixis control opponent, and we saw the pain there. Here comes the Reanimate. Not sure if Dylan was hoping to play around the Reanimate or if he was just going to cop it as it comes, but Omnath is going to see control on Jeff's side, and it's going to be painful. This is a big creature for Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's necessarily much to be criticized with Dylan's line.
No.
I mean, he worked through the answers that he knew Jeff had. You can't really just sit there forever as the mid-range deck. You do have to present those threats. He sort of got unlucky that Jeff did in fact have that counterspell, which he was then able to chain into this Reanimate, which has been pretty big swing for him.
Yeah. This is interesting. This must have just been a really recent draw from Dylan, but we see the Endurance being flashed in and possibly blocking by the looks of it. So just a chump block at the moment, as it is a 3/4, but you will get the value of shuffling the opponent's graveyard into the deck and going again. And this is the 1-2 punch that we saw before from Dylan, where a little bit of combat here, a little bit of combat there will get it all through. But the Lightning Bolt plus the Endurance was not enough. Jeff showing off that force of will there.
Yeah, managing to keep Dylan's Omnath that has been reanimated by Jeff nice and safe, which does represent that incidental life gain as well as being a threat that stays on the board.
Yeah, and thankfully Dylan did have that follow-up with the Prismatic Ending at its best in Dylan's 4-color deck, because 5 if you're talking about this Underground Sea as well, but Prismatic Ending, exile a permanent with X is Converge, so if you pay 2 different colors for it, it will exile a 2-drop and so on and so forth. So we were able to pay 4 mana there, exile the Omnath, and here comes our next plays, which is a Hull Breacher. Interesting, interesting with Dylan. I think by the looks of it, that was a surprise block with the Hull Breacher to take out that Delighted Halfling. And sometimes we like to attack with our underpowered creatures to send a message, but Jeff said message received. Here's a message of my own, and deployed a 3/2 that blocked the Delighted Halfling.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's sort of one of those things where you just kind of have to do it. If the creature doesn't have that much value as a body, chipping in with a bit of damage here and there, it can really add up, particularly if you are looking at something like the One Ring, or maybe trying to finish off the game with a cheeky Lightning Bolt play. A few points of life here and there can definitely add up.
That's true. That's true. You wouldn't want to wish you attacked with your Delighted Halfling because your opponent was on 1 life and you couldn't get back into the game, so I definitely understand that. Jeff's gone on the offensive now, 3/2 and 3/2 Hull Breacher, and the 1/1 Baleful Strix attacking in for 4 damage total. Dylan responding with a Spellseeker, and it looks like we're going to go for the Ephemerate line again.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a brave line, I guess, into this kind of game state. Jeff's sitting on, I think, 4 cards now.
Yeah.
With his most recent draw step. So any sort of line of like block and ephemerate your Spellseeker, it is definitely quite easy to get blown out. And the onus is definitely on Dylan at this stage to find something that is an answer.
Yeah, and it's going to be a bit awkward here. We saw the removal spell, that was enough. So removal spell, targeting the Spellseeker, we're ephemerating in response, and then here comes the Bowmasters. We saw a lot of Lord of the Rings cards, both this game and the game before, and the game before that as well, I suppose. We saw the Ring and Aragorn and Bowmasters. They seem to be making quite the splash in the Highlander format.
Bowmasters is a really good card.
Oh yeah, big time. It's funny, they nerfed it in Arena, and just all they did was took away the ETB. It's impressive how much worse that card is without the ETB.
Yeah, it definitely becomes more of sort of a tech option without the ETB, rather than just something you can kind of slap in your deck, and it has a really, really high, but its low isn't that bad.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So for our YouTube crew, thank you for watching. This is round 2 of our CBR MTG CanBrawl 2, hosted by Josh and Pat's MTG Bazaar, and hosted at Jolt Games in Canberra. So thanks for joining us, Phil.
No problem.
And
Happy to be here.
See you for next round.